Welcome back, Wanderer, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today we're joined by Emmett Furey, a seasoned writer, narrative designer, and transmedia producer. Emmett's background includes such impressive work as Niantic's mobile game Ingress, writing for a live-stream RPG series for Geek Sundry Alpha, and serving as an instructor in the Screenwriting Department at the New York Film Academy. The focus for our conversation today is to delve deep into the essence of storytelling, exploring the concepts of narrative correlationism and participatory storytelling. Emmett, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Joe. Happy to be here.
I'm excited to chat with you because I have a little bit of a love for everything story, and story as an evolutionary tool, something that's kind of always interested me for a long time, maybe not always, but for a long time. And this is your area of specialty, so I'm excited to pick your brain about some of these complex ideas. But before we get into it, I do like to have a little bit of a foundation, origin story. How did Emmett fall in love with games and writing and the whole world of story? How did you find your way to where you are today?
I think story, the thing that probably made me want to be a writer and a creator in this way first was probably Star Wars, which, sure, I'm not alone in that. There's probably quite a few people that have had a similar story. I think I saw Return of the Jedi in a second-run theater when I was like 4 or something. And I don't even have a conscious memory of. I just anecdotally understand that occurred. And, I played it with all the action figures in my parents' basement and told stories for myself, which I feel like was the first time that I, started to tell stories for anyone and fell in love with sort of the big sprawling world of it and all the different characters and worlds and side stories. And so there was that. And then played video games from a pretty young age too. I was born in 1980, so had pretty, played with, from the first Nintendo and some before that, Atari before that. And, my tastes in games have sort of evolved over the years. But, I've always loved, I guess, games and telling stories. And I like it when you can have both.
Amen. Did you play any tabletop role-playing games, board games, any physical space games growing up?
I did play some tabletop RPGs growing up, and it's kind of surprising in retrospect that I didn't play more. I would say when I was younger, I was actually more excited by tabletop games for the lore in those books. Like I would get the Star Wars tabletop RPG books and be excited about the the details of the imperial bureaucracy and all sorts of weird little things that they don't put in any other book.
Right.
And it's, so I didn't play a ton back then, but I did some. And nowadays I play a ton and run a bunch of games, so become a real important part of my life in, recent years.
All right, well, let's dig into the topic of the day. So before we go deep, let's set the stage here. I'm curious, what is your definition of quote unquote story? What elements are essential for something to be a narrative?
Yes, a good question. And before I launch into that, I'll just say up front for everybody that, I'm a writer, a narrative designer, a creator, an artist, I guess. And I'm definitely not a scientist. So in a lot of what we're talking today involves a sort of philosophy of art that I've developed over the past bunch of years as a participatory storyteller that, obviously there's a lot of science and philosophy involved, and I'll speak authoritatively about it. But, that is just, I'm a layman scientist who has read a bunch of stuff, and some of it's, I'm sure, more complex than I even know. But I think it maps to story pretty well. So I thought I'd get that out of the way up front. But yeah, so story. The way I've been defining it in this process is meaningful connections across time. And I think, generally speaking, those kinds of meaningful connections are, to our knowledge, mainly only possible via consciousness as we know it. This tendency of the neurons in our brains to fire together, to wire together, this conscious mechanism that makes learning and experience possible. and really the conscious mechanism that makes time possible. Like, to non-conscious beings, there's not really a past or memory or a future. There's always just the now. And the past is sort of the stories of days gone by, and the future is sort of stories that haven't happened yet. And neither thing's really accessible without consciousness. In terms of what is necessary for a story to have, it's a good question. I was thinking the main thing is that its component parts be able to be perceived to be meaningfully connected by the audience. And also, ideally, I think, to be seen sort of in the aggregate, to have a sort of beginning, a middle, and an end, both that you can see the connections and that there's a whole story there, like it all adds up to something, even as subjective as that may be in the minds of each of the individual members of your audience. And, I think in a story well told, every piece of it is there for a reason. Every piece of it is connected to either something that came before it or something that will come after. And in relation to all that, I've been thinking of late that one of the most important roles of a narrative artist is deciding what to include in their story and what to leave out. Because if you include too many extraneous scenes that can distract from what the story is meant to be about, and you inadvertently leave out important details that can disrupt the ability of the audience to experience the work as a coherent narrative, I would say.
That makes perfect sense. I want to dig more into participatory storytelling and narrative correlationism. But before we get there, you mentioned how story is part of what makes us human, what makes a conscious being. It's something that conscious beings are uniquely aware of. And I'm curious, I've read books, The Storytelling Animal comes to mind right away, of how story is an evolutionary tool. It's something that our species developed as a tool to assist us in evolution. I'm curious your theories on that. What are your thoughts of the evolution of storytelling as a tool, and how significant are stories in the evolution of humans? Not a big subject or nothing.
There's a lot of importance to storytelling in human history. Certain things like being able to respond to novel threats appropriately and fast enough, things that aren't really sort of programmed done to us on a genetic level, that, new things that we encounter and can learn from the situation. But I think one of the biggest values of it would be the that it helps us sort of remember and use moments from our past to pave the way for our future. The way we can sort of play out hypothetical future stories in our heads, determine what we should and shouldn't do in certain situations, and without sort of needing to engage in that like potentially dangerous sort of trial and error process. It's like, rather than, we can sort of game it all out and then decide on the course of action. Not that we always are correct, but at least it's a safer way than sort of like going out and trying something particularly dangerous. And then that all sort of compounds into even more useful when we get to the idea of language and being able to tell stories to other people, because, written and spoken stories would sort of make it possible for knowledge to survive beyond the lifespan of the people that coined it. And then that kind of communication also sort of let people undertake tasks that really no one person would have been able to do on their own, right. And teach each other how to do things. So I think those are sort of some of my biggest thoughts on that.
Bingo. It makes stories an important part of our evolution for sure. Okay, with that established, let's move into this interesting concept. I had not even heard the term before I started reading your blog and your posts. Narrative correlationism. Can you explain what this is, how human consciousness is inherently narrative? This whole idea, I'm curious.
Yeah, so that's a narrative correlationism is this philosophy of art I sort of alluded to earlier in our chat. That I guess it's a term that I came up with in the past couple of years. I mean, I've been working on the basis of it for probably 10, 15 years, but like the name came, of course, more recently. Narrative is clear for what we're doing here. Correlationism is a school of philosophy that essentially says because of the way our brain builds connections, essentially says that we can't really see the reality of something that we're perceiving independent of our own sort of conscious workings. It's always connecting to something else from our past, something else from our life. And so so that's what the correlationism comes in. And as far as this, as narrative correlationism, it's basically saying that everything new we experience is via consciousness meaningfully connected to something we've experienced in our past. And those meaningful connections across time are stories, per my definition that we talked about before. Mm-hmm. So narrative correlation is in part an affirmation of the sort of widely held idea that human beings experience the world of stories, that the human conscious experience is sort of narrative by nature. But it's also an affirmation of the subjectivity of human experience, of this idea that any given person's narrative experience of a piece of art will always be a gestalt melding of the artwork as presented and the conscious connections that they sort of forge with it. So I think that's kind of the root of it. And then there's a lot more we can unpack over the course of our talk, but yeah.
Okay, so how does that philosophy that you've developed impact your work when you're writing or crafting narratives?
Yeah, so this is a big one. So basically, what narrative correlationism says is that narrative writ large is not really a property of the artwork. It's sort of the experience that the audience has while engaging with the art. And once I sort of acknowledged that, it made me realize that the art isn't really an end unto itself. And that therefore what I really ought to be focusing on is how the artwork facilitates a narrative experience in the minds of the people who engage. So I've been calling narrative correlationism an audience first, anti-auteur philosophy. And the reason for that is I kind of believe that there are a lot of auteurs out there who think I'm right and my audience is wrong. The only correct interpretation of my art is the one that I had in mind when I created it. And to me, that mindset kind of goes against the purpose of art. The art that I make is not for me. Those stories have sort of lived in my head rent-free for as long as it's taken me to tell the story. And if it isn't for me, I kind of think it shouldn't be about me. And on the flip side, if we sort of acknowledge that art is for the audience, then it stands to reason to me that artists maybe should create their works with the audience experience foremost in mind. So obviously the sort of discursive artwork is an important part of that, but there's a lot of things you can take into account in terms of how the audience is going to experience what you're doing. And this is certainly, and honestly, like I said, we'll talk a bit about sort of participatory storytelling, which is sort of my term for where my career has taken me. And this stuff is incredibly relevant to that. But I think this is actually relevant to sort of what I call more lean back media too, the sort of non-interactive, non-participatory traditional media where you don't really have an opportunity to impact your narrative experience of the work. But I still think that, there are opportunities even there for artists to really pay attention to, what is the audience experience of this going to be? And that's, something that, has been one of the core through lines, I think, for my work, whatever it may be. A lot of my work seems disparate and no two of my jobs have been the same, but there is always this through line of like building into it a space for the audience to be a part of the story or at the very least to have sort of interactive opportunities to sort of impact their experience of the narrative.
That's powerful. I can see right away how it impacts participatory storytelling. And we're going to get into that term because I love that term. And I've heard like playwrights and actors in classical theater talk about how a play doesn't exist until an audience is there watching it and how that experience is what makes it what it is. But this even applies, you think, to like novels, like that something that is feels strictly one way, there is actually a space there for how the audience interprets and how an audience receives that piece of work?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, yeah, given, narrative correlationism also sort of suggests that, which, anybody who buys into subjectivity would probably agree with, that like, there will be as many interpretations of a work of art as people who experience of it. And really, we don't even, if you watch a movie again or read a book again, you've changed in the interim, so your experience of it will change again. Not least of which because you sort of, already know certain details, so you're freed up to focus on other things. But, I feel like there's a lot of, some of the opportunities in non-interactive work to sort of still account for and the audience interpretation and the audience experience. Examples of it I would give are like, you can go in, if you're working in a particular genre, you'll want to know the tropes of your genre, and then you'll be pretty convinced that you pretty reasonably assume that your audience knows those tropes too. So you know what they're expecting, and then you decide at each point when do you give them what they're expecting and when do you subvert those expectations. So you sort of know that in their experience they're going to probably be familiar with the tropes of this genre, and that allows you to sort of mess with them. At times give them exactly what they want, at times not. Another example of this would be you can sort of subvert people's expectations in terms of sort of the medium that you're using. Examples I give a lot are like the Orson Welles War of the Worlds adaptation radio broadcast, where he it sounded like a radio newscast about an alien invasion of New Jersey. The reason he made it sound like that is, he knew that people at the time were programmed for radio news broadcasts to feel like they're the truth because they tend to convey the truth, So, and that the same idea can raise to more recent stuff like the Blair Witch Project, the way it subverted documentary film, and the way we know that, like, long unedited takes and natural lighting and shaky cam, we so associate that with documentary, and we so associate documentary with, it being true or factual, that when, because your audience feels that way, you can build into your narrative experience that thing to make them feel a particular way. And that's all sort of independent of the story and the characters and the diegetic story world, right? Like, all that's important, of course, but there's a lot of things that I think you can do, like I said, even in the more lean back traditional media, that takes the audience experience of it into account and crafts the experience to make them feel a certain way about what they're engaging with.
I feel like coming at a work with that particular philosophy, that particular lens, perhaps facilitates the ability to come up with something new, something that's a different twist, because you're aware of how this is going to impact your audience and what the topical subjects are and what the current conventions are, and you know how to twist them, which sounds cool.
Yeah, I would agree. Very much so. That's part of why, a lot of my work has been just taking platforms or mediums that aren't necessarily designed for fiction and using them to create fiction, and then exploring, what kind of experience does that create? What does that make the audience feel, and what kind of stories thrive in that environment,
That's so cool. Okay, I want to move on to participatory storytelling, because that's really neat too. But I just want to put a pin in this. You have a blog, or it's a series of posts. You explore this area. People can find more, because we could go way deeper on this particular philosophy. People can find your work on this, right? Online?
Yeah, absolutely. So one day I might collect it all into a book, but in the short term, I decide the middleman and just start posting them as articles on LinkedIn. So they're all on my LinkedIn. I also did put a new tab on my website, emmettfurey.com, called Narrative Evolution, which is sort of this theory we've been talking about. And that links to the first 10 of those articles, which is where I'm up to at this moment. The first 10 sort of lay the groundwork for the philosophy and sort of explore it in terms of traditional media, like we've been talking about. And right now I'm taking a little bit of a breather while I prepare the next big chunk of the posts. The next posts will be where I'll be getting into sort of participatory art and earnest. It's really what I've been gearing up the entire time to talk about, but it ended up taking these 10 articles to sort of set it up, for better or worse. But, and then in the remainder or in addition to sort of exploring participatory storytelling in all its forms, also sort of deep dive into a lot of my own work in that area, like kind of, talk about all of my major projects in this sort of vein and what I did and what worked and what did and why I did what I did, what I've learned. And so, I mean, that means that today you and the viewers will get a little bit of well, depending on when this airs, a little bit of a preview of some of that stuff, because like I said, I have a bunch of it sort of written, but none of them finished, just like a bunch of in progress posts that will eventually make their way out into the world. So that's, yes. So but yes, this is a good time to catch up because there's a break and those 10 are just there. So,
cool.
It's out there for people to buy.
Okay. Well, I will have links down in the comments or in the show notes or wherever they are.
Thank you.
But you set the stage perfectly for the next chunk of our little chat here. Let's dig into participatory art. So before we go too far into it, we're talking, help me out here. We're talking about like alternate reality games. We're talking about live action role-playing games. We're talking about tabletop role-playing. What, for you, define participatory games or art?
Yeah, so basically the way I've been defining it, I tried to find a catch-all term, and, words and definitions are always controversial, and, so I landed on participatory, and the way I've been defining it to try to capture the broadest sense of it all, like capture all the work in this area that I've done and that I'm aware of. I've been saying participatory art is any artwork that facilitates for its audience the ability to make choices to impact their narrative experience. And so the reason I included that is obviously there's a brand of participatory art that is interactive in the way where like you're playing a character in the story, like in role-playing games or LARP, or you're controlling an avatar that's a character in a story like in a video game. But there's also works that, I would consider participatory where you're not that, where you're still sort of a voyeur or an observer, but you get to make decisions that impact your experience. An example of that might be Sleep No More, the cool immersive theater piece in New York that's been running for a bunch of years and sadly I think is ending this year if it hasn't already. But in that one, essentially you're wandering through this entire like multi-floor warehouse space of different sets and actors, and you wearing a mask and aren't allowed to interact with the performers, but other than that, you're sort of sharing the spaces. And in what my friend Noah Nelson has a group called No Proscenium here in LA and caters to a bunch of other cities as well. And it's all about like immersive theater. And the reason, he calls it No Proscenium is, historically in a play, there is that proscenium arch that separates you, the audience, from the characters and the world they're inhabiting on the stage. And the thing about immersive theater is a lot of times that barrier goes away. So in a show like Sleep No More, you're wandering around. And so while for the most part, you're not allowed to interact with the actors, you're not playing a character, and they're mostly not acknowledging that you exist, you're still an audience in a traditional sense. In that show, though, you sort of take back some of your sort of syntactical control of your experience. Like you decide what scenes you watch in what order, and if two characters are in a scene together and they go in different directions, you can say, I'm going to follow that person, or I could walk into a part of the set where no one is and just go through the drawers and read things on the tables. So to my mind, that's still participatory because you're making decisions that impact your experience. Whereas, if we're all sitting in a theater watching a movie together, we're not really afforded those opportunities. We're all sort of fed the same, discursive material in the same order. And the only sort of distinction between my experience and anyone else in that theater would be, just whatever my own some nature of subjectivity, whatever my own consciousness brings, directing my attention to stuff that, resonates with me in my past experience. But yeah, for narrow correlation, that's how I've been finding it. And all that being said, I think what excites me the most, I think the kinds of participatory art that excite me the most are the ones where the audience get to feel like they're a part of the story, like we talked about, like where they get to play a character in it, or sometimes, if you look at things like LARP or tabletop, in those experiences, you you become the heroes of the story. The story is all around you and all about you, and every other supporting character and every other thing that the storyteller is doing is designed to put you in the center of it and make your actions and decisions be what becomes the story. And, I think the way it sort of relates back to narrative correlationism would be to say that, if we know that our audience's narrative experience lives within the confines of their head and their conscious mind, then sort of the more we focus on what's going on in their head, I think the better. Like I mentioned earlier, I sort of said that, I called sort of non-participatory art sort of lean back media, where you're just sort of passively consuming it without an agency to really impact your experience of it. There is, again, not to denigrate it, there's plenty of incredibly impactful, traditional media projects. But what they always sort of boil down to at base is that you're watching stories about other people. And sort of for my money, no stories are more impactful than the ones that we experience ourselves. And in participatory art, especially the kind that facilitates the audience to be a character within the story stops being about the decisions made by other people. It becomes about the decisions made by the audience. And, when the story turns hinge on decisions that you as an audience member have made, as opposed to decisions made by other fictional characters, the impact of those decisions can carry a lot more weight. In really deep participatory experiences, the decisions that the audience make along the way sort of become the story. And in the process, the audience becomes the central characters. Every other character in participatory art really exists to serve the audience. It creates sort of this negative space for the audience to inhabit. And the decisions that sort of matter the most are not the ones made by the other characters, but the ones made by the people inhabiting these roles in the story.
I'm curious. I'm curious where you see this form of art evolving, how it's going to change storytelling moving forward. But I'm also kind of curious quickly before that, in your research, in your reading, in your process of developing this over the years and years and years, how far back does participatory storytelling go? Like, do we know how far back that goes?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would say that it stems, that participatory storytelling stems, and in fact, possibly all modern performance stems from ritual, like ritual performance. And it's interesting. I think it was a guy named Richard Schechner who did a lot of experiments in the 60s in what he called, what did he call it? It was basically a forerunner to the modern time of kind of immersive theater. And he did a lot of research into ritual, and, he made a lot of interesting corollaries between sort of immersive performers and shaman, the people who sort of preside over rituals historically. And sort of but what was interesting was, I think that is absolutely applicable to immersive performers in the sense that, like, they're sort of facilitating for the audience in those experiences, the parameters. And I think that perhaps the most applicable corollary from shamanism in this regard is a game master in a tabletop RPG or the storytellers at a LARP, just because those experiences, like ritual, historically are transformative. You sort of sometimes take on a role of, in a ritual of some characters from history. You're reenacting some important thing from the past of your society to sort of reinstantiate it and achieve its effects. And in role playing, you're playing a role of another character in another world, and the game master and the storytellers, they can set all those parameters and facilitate you going through this transformative experience. You transform from you into whoever you happen to be playing. You live within the shoes of that character. You make the decisions, respond to whatever the sort of GM throws at you, and then go from there. So, like, with that in mind, that obviously goes way back, right? Like way back into human history. So I think, and I think there's still probably a lot we can unearth about what we can learn from ritual in terms of telling stories, especially in the participatory kind. one thing that is going to come up, I think in probably the first post in the next series, it's all of my series, it's all about participatory art, is we talked about how, the power of ritual was rooted in belief, like if you go to like a Catholic mass and you are a believer in the faith, then that is a transformative experience. And if you go and you're not, that is performance at best, right? Like, and actually, I think Schechter also commented on the idea that he thinks, the idea of an audience as a detached observer probably originated when ritual in society sort of took a back seat, and because those things were inherently participatory as they were designed. But one thing that it's probably good to work the second post in my series is going to be about, I'm going to take a brief moment that even though participatory art in my mind on a base level is trying to create a more lifelike experience in a way to make it more meaningful, there is also a really important thing to mention. So I think now is as good time as any, that it is actually not good to, you can't convince people, right? Like, everyone needs to know, even though they're playing a role in whatever form you give for them, or they're participating in the narrative, they don't have to believe it's real for it to feel real. And I think it's, dubious and dangerous to sort of pass off fiction for fact in any form. So as much as like we're basically trying to make it feel as real as possible, while everyone knows at every step of the way that it isn't. So I guess sort of the distinction that I've landed on is, whereas ritual is about belief, for me, participatory art is about suspension of disbelief. So it's not about belief in the sense that I'm trying to convince anyone that it's real. And you don't try to cause a hoax. And again, I don't think Orson Welles has said in retrospect that he wasn't trying to cause a hoax. He wasn't trying to trick people into thinking that this was an actual news report about an actual alien invasion. There were, moments throughout the broadcast that said this is, a radio play and not real. But, people might have missed those. There were long stretches they tuned in late because there was a popular radio show right before it that was ending, and they missed the initial answer, and there wasn't another explanation for a while. So anyway, that is that little cautionary tale, I think.
Oh, well, that's a good point to make. Okay, so that touches on that, but participatory storytelling, participatory art, it feels special. Like you've hinted at it, like this connection between the artist and the audience and the interchange and how they're both go a little deeper on that for me. I'm curious your thoughts on that relationship.
Oh, the audience, the relationship between the audience and the
creator, the artist, the like, it's not like the artist is just creating something and the audience is consuming it anymore. They're working together to create something. It almost feels like at that point.
Yeah, 100%. I sort of, participatory art, it really becomes sort of an act of co-creation. And in this research, there was a dancer who I think back in the 60s, 70s, her name was Anna Halpern, and she had a quote that I really love. And she says that artists evoke the art within us all. And I think that quote is really applicable to what I've been trying to say with narrative correlationism. So let's talk about let's go back to a book or a novel, like we mentioned. Like it might be sort of easy for us to take consciousness and story for granted at this point in our lives to say that story springs fully formed from the pages of the novel. But really, there's a lot of things that have to be in place for that to occur. We need to understand language in general and the particular language the book is written in, and we have to understand that that time can be organized into chronology of events and all of this other stuff. That absent, the book is just sort of a stack of papers with unrecognizable markings on. Like, again, it sort of gets down to the idea that there is no meaning in that piece of art. It doesn't become meaningful until it's sort of processed through the prism of the audience's sort of conscious mind. So in a way, then each audience member of any piece of art is sort of bears some responsibility in generating the narrative experience that they're having. Even in this kind of lean back area where, again, obviously it can't interact with the story of the novel and it's presented in sort of a linear way. But I think that's what Halpern might have meant when she said that art evokes art within us all. That basically, the narrative artwork creates the parameters for the audience to complete the cycle and turn that bunch of data on the pages into a narrative inside their own head. But when you get to participatory art that we've been talking about, the level of co-creation kind of increases by leaps and bounds. Participatory art like tabletop RPGs and LARPs really kind of redefine the relationship between the audience and the storyteller in a few important ways. For one, like I said earlier, the audience or the players in those experiences sort of become the central characters. They sort of live the story from inside it instead of vicariously living it by watching fictional characters go through it. And then past that, a lot of LARP runners and tabletop game masters don't even come in with an ending plan. Like, the story becomes whatever the players do, whatever they decided as those characters, whatever they did in response to whatever the storyteller threw at them. And obviously the way that participatory art evokes the art within us all in that context is more obvious and can be really profound. And I think a great sort of side effect of this kind of storytelling is that it enables people who don't think they're creative enough to be writers to meaningfully contribute to a story. It sort of scratches that creative itch in its participants. And even if that's the only kind of storytelling that they ever engage in, that's maybe more than they were likely to have done on their own. And also, though, I think a lot of people who engage with participatory art on a long enough time frame realize that they are creative in that way and sort of evolve to become storytellers and game masters in their own right. And really, kind of in a weird way, narrative correlationism is saying that we're all born storytellers, because as a side effect of conscious processing, merely existing in the world could be considered a narrative act. So on that level, we really are all creative in that way. And it's just a matter of learning how to sort of take what we know about life and living through a story and creating it by sort of curating the parts of our past that are most meaningful to remember because of their impact on our future, making those decisions that artists make, what do we leave in? What do we take out? And that defines, we'll actually probably get back into this later on in our talk, but, that defines what we think about ourselves and what we think about the world in a really important way.
I remember reading your posts, one of the first ones, going into that concept of how we're narrative beings just by the fact that in order to understand our existence, we have to create a narrative in our mind about how we're existing and what we're interacting with. And I had read it somewhere else before probably, but it really brought it home for me. I'm curious because I can think of times that as a game runner or a game builder, I've had players come out of their shell and become storytellers over a session or over a campaign. Can you think of examples from your work, from times that you've been creating things or working on things where you've seen participatory storytelling touch people on a deeper level?
Yeah, one of the projects that I like to sort of talk about when we explored questions about this was a project I worked on called The New Adventures of Peter and Wendy. It was a web series that I worked as a transmedia producer on. And so that was it was a modern adaptation of Peter Pan, obviously, and a shot sort of vlog style. There were a lot of, in that era, this was probably the late 2000. There were a lot of sort of web series adaptations of classic literature at that time done in this sort of vlog style because it's a little bit easier than, all your bunch of different camera angles. So the web series was shot and edited in advance like any TV show would be. But as a transmedia producer, my job was to kind of oversee every other aspect of the experience, which in this case was something that really actually is a good way to get into some of my earliest experiments in participatory storytelling, which was me playing fictional characters on Twitter usually, but on social media, sort of in real time, me making a bunch of accounts, talking to myself as the characters, and in some cases talking to the fans as the characters. And the sort of jump that we made with Peter and Wendy as compared to earlier experiments of mine in that regard was that we also encouraged the fans to make their own fake accounts for their own fictional characters who lived in Neverland, Ohio, the fictional town where our version of the Peter Pan story was being set, and to sort of tell their own stories in parallel, but also in conjunction with, because they had opportunities to overlap and interact with the official characters played by me in this weird kind of like online performance art, which again is not that different than like playing an NPC in an RPG. It's just sort of text-based in this regard, and can therefore reach anyone anywhere in the world. We just imagine that we're all in a physical space together, but that Twitter sort of facilitates us to do that. And, one nice thing about that is that we led by example and showed them how you can use Twitter. This is another example of taking a medium that isn't necessarily used for fiction and exploring what it feels like. But it also, our fans who engaged with this didn't have necessarily the resources to mount a web series like we did. But once we showed them that you could tell stories by making characters on Twitter and having them interact with each other, they started to do that, and they started to be a lot more prolific than I was in terms of the number of tweets output. And I think we had a pretty young audience, like teenage girls for that one, and they have a lot of time. They don't have jobs, they have school, but they have spent a lot of time on social media, and it's, but so I'll tell a story that, like, one of my favorite stories from that era. And so in this adaptation, John Darling was sort of OCD about a lot of things, including cleaning. It's very clean and cleanliness and organization. And so there was a fan character called Saw Blue. Right, so jump back. The creators of New Peter and Wendy described it like New Girl with Fairies, in the sense that it's like mostly in our present day world that we would recognize, except that like magic exists and mermaids and fairies exist, but otherwise it's it's a lot like our world of today. And so this fan character, Saw Blue, was a fairy. I don't know who this person is in real life. I never really interact with them in that way. But this character sort of tweeted at John, like, hey, you should come over and help me clean my apartment. And I thought, well, that sounds like something John would do. So I said, sure. And of course, to be clear up front here, this was all text role play. I don't know who this person is or where in the world they were. We were just sort of using the medium of Twitter to sort of, in a text-based role play scenario, play these scenes out. So I said, sure. So I went over there and we were role playing back and forth on Twitter, like our interactions as we were helping this character clean their apartment. The fan character started sort of hitting on John and saying, like, we should go to dinner and see a movie. And as another cautionary tale here, it would not have been appropriate for me to role play that. I don't know who this person is, how old they are. Like, that wasn't going to happen. But I still, in the spirit of this whole thing, wanted to yes and it to a degree. So I had John be like, listen, I'm really busy with my job at the paper that my dad runs, and I can't like date anyone. But if you want to have dinner and see a movie, understanding that it's not a date, we could do that. And this character said, sure. So I bought myself another roleplay scene, I guess. So on another day at a prescribed time, we were going to roleplay them having dinner and going to see this movie. And what was interesting was that the fan role players started to ship these two characters, which was a term that I didn't know at the time, but I know now, which is sort of like like basically any time in the history of media when fans want two of the fictional characters to get together romantically. This might have been one of the few times or one of the earliest examples of, fans shipping sort of a fan-created character with an official character in a way that could theoretically occur, but wasn't going to because, like, as I said. So anyway, but what was funny was, we went and had them role-played with this fan, like them having dinner and going to a movie. The other fan role-players were role-playing on Twitter, like hiding in bushes with like trench coats and hats on, trying to encourage, Lady in the Tramp style, like romantic things to occur in these scenes that, were not going to occur. But, neither here nor there. Kind of interesting scene. And it sort of, it all petered out. In retrospect, the fans sort of referred to that as these characters undate because nothing actually happened. But where the nice little capper came around was the way their story ended up going. And the thing that I guess was planned from the beginning, but I actually didn't know in the first season, was that John in our station is gay. And in light of that, when I learned that, the lead up to season 2, I was like, I feel as if we ought to acknowledge some of what came before in relation to this. Because, it was all a little awkward, that there was like sort of romantic interest being espoused by the character and as sort of a not acceptance of that. And so I wanted to address it, but what I thought was that because sometimes Twitter was sort of a liminal medium in this. Sometimes it was standing in for Twitter. It was like, this is John Darling's Twitter account. But other times it was, again, as we mentioned, sort of like this a window into the actual physical life where, where some scenes are assumed to be, hey, we're actually in a shared physical space in the real world, and everyone is just getting a window into that they maybe wouldn't otherwise. So I didn't think this would be something that John would just put out on blast on his social media. So instead, I did a thing, which I didn't do a ton of, but where I had a direct message exchange with John and this fan character. And John was essentially saying, listen, I wanted you to know, like, on our date last year, I was aware of your interest, and, I consider you a good friend, and I wanted you to understand, like, I was figuring some things out about myself at the time, and it turns out it's kind of literally not you, it's me, because I am interested in a different gender than you are. And just I also had him say, listen, I don't know if I'm fully ready to publicly say this yet, so I would appreciate it if you not talk about it yet, but I wanted you to know. That fan character, I enjoyed giving them that agency because they could have just said whatever they wanted. They didn't, they kept that secret. And I mean, at that point in the season 2, the writing was on the wall. People kind of already knew, it just hadn't been officially said yet. But this fan got, because of their level of engagement, they got a little preview and a little one-on-one experience that, again, not everyone got, but excites everyone to know that it's possible. Like, basically, after the story came out, the fan, out of character, screenshotted the discussion and then shared it for the benefit of the rest of the fans, which is perfectly fine and what I would have wanted to happen. I'm perfectly happy for the rest of the fandom to get to see that occurred. But, that was an example of a thing that, like, I just yes-anded my way into, like you do in improv or a role-playing scenario. And, it's an experience that I feel probably a lot of people have had, where, like, maybe an ex of theirs realizes they're gay after the fact. And, this I thought was a really interesting way, in a way that wasn't planned at all, right? And maybe couldn't have been planned, to explore that in an interactive way. So I don't know, that's a story that I liked because I just thought it was just an interesting organic thing that I think meant a lot to that fan and to the other fans who were following the story and engaging in the text role play aspect of the experience. And that's the thing where the power of this kind of storytelling can be seen.
It certainly illustrates the depth that the narrative, the experience can go to. That's incredible. I've seen other uses of social media in narrative, in storytelling, and in participatory art. Where do you think it's going to go? Looking forward, what do you think the evolution of technology, specifically like social media and platforms like that, in the space of telling stories?
Social media. Well, yeah. So I have, as an artist and a human being, I have sort of a love-hate relationship with social media. Back when X was Twitter, and before it was sort of a dumpster fire, that was the platform where, as I said, I did my first sort of experiments in participatory storytelling. So, I have a fondness for it, at least in those days. On the other hand, per the warning I gave earlier, social media has really made it easier than it's ever been in human history for people to pass off fiction as fact. Like I said, and I promise not to get too political here, but example of it would be the sort of the QAnon conspiracy. And there have been people who run in my circles who have posited that people behind that might have been following the playbook of alternate reality games, because the mobilizational power of participatory art is very high, and it can be a dangerous sort of tool in the wrong hands. QAnon built little puzzles into their posts to make it's the people who followed it feel like they were figuring out things for themselves. It's why they, the QAnoners would call people who get their news passively from like news networks sheep, because they're like, hey, we figured this out. Like QAnon would list 5 things and not explain the connection, but the people were primed to assume there was a connection, and then they would go dig one up, and then it felt so more impactful to them because they figured it out. It wasn't something that was spoon-fed to them. And that's a very powerful tool in storytelling, but I guess usually when I deploy it, everyone understands that we're in a fictional scenario, and in that one, a lot of people didn't. So that is really just another sort of this come back to the cautionary tale. And similarly, even though presumably, no, if you take the example we just talked about, Peter and Wendy, even though presumably none of the fans at any point believed that they were talking to Peter Pan and Wendy Darling and John Darling really.
Right.
The fact that it happened on Twitter in and amongst their interactions with their real world friends and brands and celebrities, and again, let them suspend their disbelief in making it feel real, but without them needing to think that it was. So I guess that's how I feel about social media, is that it's a great tool in a lot of ways for storytelling and just for connecting people across the globe, but it's also dangerous in the ways that we know it's dangerous. So, I just urge caution in that regard. Like, keep our stories. It's not really, if you think it's real, it's not really an artistic experience, right? It's a real one. That's not great, as we've seen.
Yeah, for sure. Back in early 2000s, I think it was 9 Inch Nails, they released an album, and they did an augmented reality, layered reality marketing campaign where they slowly released little things, and then you had to hunt down Easter eggs and figure out websites to go to. And the whole narrative behind it was this invasion of these extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings. It was brilliant, and it was fun, and it was so cool. But you're right. I think of some of the stuff that QAnon has done with Easter eggs and letting people discover things. There definitely is something there. Like there is that does kind of raise the question: did somebody study augmented reality and alternate reality games and then steal pieces?
Yeah, and it's certainly possible that someone just stumbled upon the same idea. But either way, it's an example of ways that you could use this powerful form of storytelling for ill, and that is worth thinking about.
Amen. All right, well, we're getting close to the end here. Let's kind of bring this together here. I guess at the heart of the discussion today, really, the whole idea behind the philosophy and participatory art is, why is story important to humanity? I mean, we've touched on it. We've talked about evolution and how it's impacted, but I want Emmett's opinion. I want to know, why is story important to humanity? How does storytelling shape our understanding and our place in the world?
Yeah, so love that question. Histories really are stories, and our own personal histories define how we think about ourselves and how we approach the world. And sort of world history defines the same thing for the societies we live in. There was a stand-up special called Nanette by a comedian named Hannah Gadsby, who said something really interesting that I think is applicable. The quote was, "We are the part of the story we focus on." And I think that's really fundamental to what I do. For example, in our personal histories, if all we do is focus on the bad things that have happened to us, it will feel to us like we're leading a bad life. The things that we choose to focus on and choose to remember. And now on the flip side, I'm not saying that we should filter out all of that stuff and just pretend it doesn't happen. That's unhealthy in its own way, living in denial in that way. But I am saying that, the way that we tell our own story impacts the way we feel about our life in a really profound way, I think. And then similarly, the societies that we're a part of are defined by the histories as written, and I think I talk about somewhere in the first 10 posts there, the first part of those articles, that that sort of aphorism of history is written by the victors. And I say sort of the power that they wield is this thing I talked about earlier about the importance role of artists to choose what to include and what not to include, because tactical or inadvertent omissions from history can render those part of our shared past invisible to future generations. And I think it's that choosing what to include and what not to include, and how you tie it all together while being one of the most important roles of narrative artists, is also one of the most important roles of our historians. I think we need to sort of celebrate our victories and acknowledge our shared failures. It's the only way we can ever really grow and change as a people, I think. So I guess that's my feeling on that stuff.
Love it. That's fantastic. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the important stuff. So I like to do a little bit of fun stuff before we head out the door. I have a question that I like to ask everybody who comes on the show. It's regardless of who you are or what we're talking about. This is my own little philosophical question that lives at the heart of this podcast, this social experiment of mine. The question is, in my opinion, there exists a magical space at the intersection of story and game, of improv and comic books and novelists and tabletop role-playing and board games, all these things where everybody can just get along. We just hang out. We just have a shared common language. Now, if you agree with me, and not everybody does, but if you do agree with me, what is the magical thread that holds this space together?
I would say that the magical thread that holds that space together is a sort of shared commitment to the story. An example, I didn't start LARPing until February 2020. That was a weird time to do it because it was the last game we had before something happened. I don't know. Something in human history that was a problem. But what I found being there amongst hundreds of other people was that, people's reasons for being there varied. Some people were there to vibe in a fantasy town. Some people were there to, hit each other with foam swords, and people like me were there to find the center of Westworld. I had to find the deepest rabbit hole of story and go all the way down it. But people, were there of different means and backgrounds, and, some with very elaborate, probably expensive costumes, and some with much less so. But despite all of those things, it all hung together as a world and a story because we were all committed to the reality of the story we were telling together. And this idea of, that's, those sort of things are one of the purest versions of co-creation, because one of the biggest differences, obviously there's a lot of similarities between LARP and tabletop RPG. One of the biggest differences is how much of your time is not directly mediated by a storyteller. In a tabletop RPG, there's a game master there the entire time telling you what you see and telling you what happens in response to everything, playing all the characters that aren't you. A lot of your time at a LARP is just talking to other players, and so it's pure co-creation. There's nobody sitting over you telling you what's happening is what's happening, and what you're doing and saying is what the story is. So I guess that would be my answer to that question, would just be as long as everybody involved is sort of committed to the story that you're telling together, that holds people together and holds the experience together.
I love that. Do you still LARP lots? Are you very active in the LARP space?
Yeah. I'm just recently on a junior story staff member of the LARP that I do. So it's just because I love telling these kinds of stories, and to me, and I'm there anyway, and to me, it's a kind of professional development too. It's a lot of my participatory work has been digitally mediated in one form or another, whether it be the text-based online interactive role play or video games that I've worked on. I haven't done a ton of design work in, physical spaces where, two people are together, other than like running RPGs and stuff, like, which of course I've done and do. So it's interesting to figure out how this works when you're fully embodying a character in a space, in a costume, which is even another distinction between that and tabletop. There's still an abstraction there where you're like imagining that you're a person in a place.
Right.
And in LARP, you are in a place and you're truly first person experiencing the story from within your own self, and you are the character. So designing for that, designing what is fun to do and engage with story-wise in that scenario is an interesting twist on things that I've been having fun delving into.
Sounds like a blast. I'm jealous. Sounds like a good time.
It's a lot of fun. I am a big proponent of it for sure.
All right. Well, we're going to start heading towards the door. I like to do a thing that I call the quick fire. It's just one last chance to get to know you a little bit better. Top of the mind answers, quick. We're just going to hit it really fast. What are you currently playing?
Let's see. Right now, I a couple days ago, I started a replay of Fallout 4 because I had watched the show recently and felt I want something new, but there isn't a new game right now, so I thought I'd dig that one up. Before that, I was playing for the first time for a few weeks Civilization 6, and then in terms of recent memory, one of the most sort of interesting, impactful games I played was the Outer Wilds, which was a really interesting game where you're sort of exploring this solar system and you're sort of caught in a sort of time loop and you're trying to solve a thing. But what I love about it is you're just sort of freely exploring and learning pieces, and you basically have 22 minutes to eventually beat the game because that's how long the time loop lasts. And your experience of the game is just going through learning what you need to do in order to do that. But what's cool about it is like none of the knowledge is gated. Like theoretically, if you knew what to do, you could do it your first time through. There's no way that you would know it. But like, it's not like, oh, I got to unlock a thing. It's like, that's all there beneath the surface of everything. And your journey through the game is just you learning all the pieces in whatever order you happen to find them. And that your ship computer will update you with important data when you found it to let you know, like, hey, this is relevant and there's more to find here. But other than that, it's a pretty unguided exploration through this sort of open world. And I thought it was really cool. A friend of mine named Tommy Hunn, who has designed a lot of cool escape rooms and immersive experiences, sort of recommended it to me and said it was his sort of white whale in terms of trying to figure out a way to like create an experience, in-person immersive experience that has that same feeling of, of it all being there under the surface. You just have to find it. So I'd say that's a pretty cool game I played in recent years.
That's going straight on my wish list. What's the name of it again?
It's the Outer Wilds, which is not the Outer Worlds, which is also a pretty good game, but that's more like a Fallout style open world, RPG. But Outer Wilds, yeah, check it out.
I am. What are you currently reading?
Am I currently reading? Right now, in recent years, most of my reading has been, some graphic novels. I'm like a lot of the work that Tom King has done recently in comic book space. A lot of the work I've been doing recently, rather reading I've been doing recently, has been research for this work I've been doing. So, this wasn't a recent one, but, one of the really underpinning books to the sort of conscious aspect of my theory comes from a book called The Ravenous Brain by a guy named Daniel Bohr. And that was just a book about consciousness. And when I had it recommended to me at like an immersive conference, maybe 15 years ago, I picked it up and I read it and I said, this book isn't drawing the connections directly between consciousness and narrative because that's not what this book is about. But it became clear to me in my head that there was a connection to be drawn. That was sort of the impetus for this 15-year journey that led to narrative correlationism and wherever it goes next. So, yeah.
Nice. Okay. All right. Okay, here's a fun one. If your essence could be distilled down and perfectly translated into a game, whether it's a video game or tabletop role-playing or LARP game, what world would it be, and what race and class would you be?
Interesting. Very interesting. I mean, I think that class-wise, I'm probably like a nerd mage, Like I want to find, like I said, I want to find all the deepest rabbit holes of story. I want to like learn all the weird arcane secrets. That's me for sure. Similarly, I tend to like, play intelligent. I like to think of myself as that in real life, and just I gravitate towards that sort of thing. So, in my LARP, I play an elf, basically. That's a pretty good fit. What was the rest of the question?
What world, what class, and what race? I think you nailed it. Except for world. Do you have a favorite game world that you always go back to?
It's a really good question. My favorite game world. I probably, I think in terms of things I always go back to, it's got to be Star Wars. That's just, I've had, my fandom has waxed and waned over the years, but I've reached sort of a zen place with it where I'm like, I want to love Star Wars. It means so much to me. And so I will consume it, and I will like some of it more than others. And that's fine. That's true of anybody in any fandom. And, so I think there's that. I always come back to Star Wars. Maybe I take breaks, but, and I'm gearing up to run like a 32-person tabletop Star Wars campaign with like 8 groups of 4. And it's the kind of nonsense that I do for fun because I'm crazy. So say that. We'll say Star Wars. That's
cool. All right. We're going to start heading towards the door here. Before we go, though, I like to open up a little space. Is there anything you're working on or have worked on that you want to promote or boost? Obviously, check out your LinkedIn and check out the articles about this interesting philosophy. But is there anything else that we should put in the links and make sure everybody knows about?
I would say the biggest thing would be that right now I've got a couple things. I have a thing in the hopper that isn't fully, signed and delivered yet, and as such, I'm not at a point where I'm allowed to talk about it. So creatively, that's TBD, hopefully. But yeah, at the moment, I'd say, if you want to check out my LinkedIn and/or my website, which I know we'll have the links for, and in specific, if you want to delve into the sort of 10 articles that lay out even more breadth or different breadth. We actually covered a lot of stuff that's not in there today, so this will be a great companion to that. I think people are interested, but yeah, love people to check that out and to share it if they are so inclined, get it out there. It's like you said, in some ways, it's just taking things that a lot of us already think to be the case and sort of exploring maybe why that is and what we can learn about it, what that can tell us about being better storytellers. I think a lot of us agree that we experience the world as narrative. And then this was just sort of an exploration of maybe how that came about and what that actually means. And, what does that say about, us and how we approach telling stories. So love to continue that conversation with people, see what people think, what people add, what people subtract, always excited to talk about it. So I appreciate you giving me the time today to do it and to let me chat with you. This has been a lot of fun.
I've loved having you here. This is one of I love the subject. I could keep going, but I can't.
Yeah.
So it's time for me to push you out the door. I push you out into the cold from my imaginary tavern here. But before you go, do you have any parting words of wisdom? One last wisdom bomb to drop on us as you head out the door.
Yeah, sure. I would say if people want to start experimenting with this kind of storytelling themselves, like I said, at the state of X under Elon, I don't know if I can responsibly suggest that aspiring participatory artists should use that platform the way I did, but it's up to you. But what I do tend to tell people is, the internet has sort of democratized this sort of content creation in a really cool way. And, anybody with a computer and a stable internet connection can use a social media platform like X to tell a text-based participatory story. And it really doesn't cost you anything outside of the sweat equity of making those accounts and doing that text role play in real time. So basically, if you want to experiment with the stuff, got to use the tools available to you. You can also pick up a tabletop RPG book because those explicitly are trying to give you the parameters and the rules for creating an experience like this for your friends. And then the other thing I say in regards to that is it's okay to start small. in that new Adventures of Peter and Wendy experience, the number of fan role players we had was not the exciting part. It was the kind of incredibly personal stories that organically emerged by facilitating that kind of participatory experience, and then the cool stories that it encouraged and facilitated the fans to make. So, you can sort of own your craft in this one experience at a time and sort of work your way up to maybe doing it professionally. I guess that's what I'd say about that.
Well, as the embers cool and our conversation starts to dwindle off, it's time for me to push you out the door. So, thank you again to Emmett for sharing your insights on storytelling as an evolutionary tool. You've certainly enlightened us all to the power of narrative and how it is ever evolving, each story adding another layer to our collective understanding of the human experience. And as always, to you, dear listener, thank you for taking your spot at the table. Until next time, keep creating, exploring, and sharing your stories with the world. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.